Hi everyone, good morning. This is Sook Lee, Senior Fellow at the East Asia Institute and also Professor at Sungkyunkwan University. I'm sitting at East Asia Institute, located in Seoul, South Korea, and I'm very pleased to moderate the webinar that is hosted by ADRN, Asian Democracy Research Network. And title of this webinar is Democratic Principles at Test, How Asian Democracies Are Combating the Pandemic. And as of today, more than 24 million people in the world got infected by the COVID-19, and about 830,000 people got killed with this virus. And experts predict that several millions of people will die as this pandemic continues to happen to the next year. And autocracies and authoritarian government may do better in combating this pandemic. However, for the democratic countries, it's very important to manage and control this pandemic while keeping the democratic principles. And therefore, it's a very challenging job for the public authority and also democracy, how we combat this pandemic. For example, lockdowns can stop not only the movement of virus, and also they stop people's freedom to move, and social distancing lessens a chance to contact the virus. However, also social distancing prevents people to assemble in a church, a temple, and a mosque. And also, citizens cannot gather for a legitimate public protest. And contact tracing through IT technology by public authority enhances the effectiveness of a quarantine. However, it also undermines individual rights for privacy. And people thinking about the post-pandemic world are deeply concerned about the strengthening of a state surveillance power of individuals. All these quarantines and closings are justified under the name of science. Following science is usually better than following the politics. However, the science has also very narrowly scoped, often ignoring humanitarian values. And from this perspective, Italian philosopher Agamben is warning us the arrival of technomedical despotism behind this legitimacy of science. Today, we have experts from 5 Asian democracies to discuss how each country is struggling to balance the pandemic fights and the democratic principles. Let me introduce these 5 experts. We have Katie Chen, the Vice President of Taiwan Foundation for Democracy. And we have Michael Ichihara from Japan, Professor at Hidochiwashi University. And we have Ketu Putra Irawan, the Executive Director of Institute for Peace and Democracy in Indonesia. And we have Jong Kim, professor at the University of North Korean Studies from South Korea. And lastly, we have Niranjan Sahu, senior fellow at the Observer Research Foundations. Okay, so I'm very excited to discuss these important topics with the 5 experts. Okay, let me divide our discussion into 2 rounds. The first round, I'll ask each panelist to talk about the performance of their country in these fights against the virus. And at the second round, I'll ask how they assess how their government is keeping and also their civil societies are maintaining the democratic principles of their country. Okay, so without further ado, let me invite Katie to speak about Taiwan case. Katie?
Thank you very much, Professor Lee. It's a pleasure for me to join you, colleagues at ADRN, and my esteemed panelists to discuss this important issue. Just very briefly about the case in Taiwan. As of the 22nd of this month, Taiwan has 487 confirmed cases of COVID-19. And unfortunately, we have 7 people who died because of the virus. 457 of those confirmed were released from treatment as of now. And Taiwan has gone through about 135 days without any local cases. So compared to countries around the world, Taiwan has been doing quite well in weathering the effects of the pandemic. So a little bit about what Taiwan has done since the beginning of this year. Our government discovered that there is a possibility of some kind of infectious disease back in January. And right after Lunar New Year, which is the beginning of February, Taiwan actually limited access to our border. So flights coming into Taiwan were canceled. And also, Taiwan has banned the export of facial mask at the end of January. So this has been going on for quite a while. And then so people in Taiwan can, they did not have the problem of getting facial masks, but you know, what we have in Taiwan was still not enough. So within about a month's time, the government of Taiwan had purchased and assembled additional lines to manufacture facial masks for the citizens. So Taiwan has now able to produce about 200 million facial masks per day, which also allowed Taiwan to donate masks to our democratic allies in the region and around the world. And I think one of the important things about the success in Taiwan in combating the virus is not only the 14-day quarantine of people who coming into Taiwan, but then there is an additional 7 days of self-monitoring, so making a total of 21 days. And then at the same time, people really are adhering to wearing facial masks in public. So there's mandatory rules of different areas. For example, public transportations, going into markets, going into not just honoring social distancing, but you have to wear facial masks. Otherwise, you're not allowed to enter into different areas. But also, I think more importantly, is Taiwanese civil societies. They're very vibrant and very active. They immediately acted upon themselves to collaborate with the government, for example, developing cell phone applications, so citizens could find out which convenience stores and drugstores still have facial masks left. And of course, the Taiwanese government also enacted mechanisms where individuals could purchase facial masks pretty much with all the convenience stores and supermarkets and drugstores. So making facial masks very accessible for individuals, so we could protect ourselves. So not only that, I was really glad to see religious organizations. Taiwan is a majority Buddhist organizations, and within these few months, there's traditionally large gatherings of practitioners following the path of deities. But major temples within Taiwan also thought about the possible spread of pandemic with very close personal interaction. So they essentially postponed these large religious activities adhering to the government's rules to later, I think a month or 2 months ago, where the waves of pandemic within Taiwan has a bit subdued. So of all that, it's a combination of civil society, citizens, and government policies that Taiwan has, and also closing down the borders that Taiwan has been able to weather the wave of infection of COVID-19. So I'll stop right here and let my other colleagues share their stories. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. You emphasize the cooperation between the very able government and civil society. Okay, let's move to Japan because obviously Japan's government is doing the similar measures. Michael, it's your turn.
Thank you very much, Jong. Well, Japan's case does not stand out well, compared to Taiwan's case. So it sounds a bit boring, but well, Japan has so far had a bit more than 64 cases of infection and the death of more than 1,200 so far, which is about 10 out of 1 million population. Basically, the central concern for the Japanese government is to protect those people who have pre-existing medical conditions by asking people with light symptoms not to rush into hospitals. On the other hand, the government has been trying not to stop the daily lives of the people to a large extent, and also not to restrict the rights of the people. And thus, in early April, when the government declared the emergency, they did not lock down the cities, but instead they only requested social distancing and health restraint. And these measures might seem tepid compared to most of the countries, but given the cultural background of Japan, where people wear facial masks daily, and people don't speak to each other in the public so much, well, you probably see Japanese trains and buses being very quiet. And so, well, given that this tepid or restrained approach has been doing fine, and well, it's I think acceptable. But there are some well issues with the Japanese government's approach, I would say, and I would raise 2 points. One is the weakness in science-based approach. Although the Japanese government established experts meeting to seek experts well, scientific advice for policy making on COVID-19, but major decisions, for example, regarding the school closure was actually determined before the convening of the experts meeting. And also, recently there was what we call Go To Travel campaign, which is a travel promotion campaign. And although experts meeting actually opposed to this campaign, that it's too early to promote travels, but the government will otherwise will implemented the promotion campaign. So there's a well, weakness in the science-based approach. And also, I also have to point out inefficiency in the system surrounding the PCR testing. As you probably know, Japan is one of the countries which has a very small population of PCR testing so far. Only 1% of the population has taken testing. And this is mainly due to the fact that it's the we have to go through the health centers, public health centers, to ask permissions for testing. And we only have 470 or so those centers in Japan, which have to oversee all the cases of possible infections. And so there's a very weakness in manpower in those centers, and people cannot reach those centers and well, spread the infection. And this also makes it difficult to capture the actual view of how many people are infected in Japan, especially at an early stage. That was so. I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you, Michael. I think it's very challenging for every government in how they can try to manage the pandemic. At the same time, they have to worry about the economy. So the closing is not the best option. So it's very difficult, how they can, minimize the closing. So that's a dilemma. All right. Now let's move to Indonesia. K2, it's your turn.
Yes. Yeah. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Indonesian government has been kind of cautious in the beginning when responding the pandemic COVID-19. Uh, it started in March of 2020. The government created a government regulation, creating an institution in the beginning, which is National Agency of Disaster Management. Uh, this one will become an institution managing intergovernmental and also coordinating with many civil society organizations, which is engaging in many part of the activities. The problem with Indonesia is that right now Indonesia already has around 163 3,000 confirmed cases and with around 2,700 additional cases daily. That is quite significant additional and around 7,000 deaths already. So the problem with Indonesia right now is, as mentioned by Sook, is that we balancing between how far is the lockdown kind of mechanism can be conducted without affecting the economic daily life of the people. So the government balancing between those two policies and put and locate the policy in the middle. We call it PSBB, which is kind of limitation of activities in the big scale. The way it's conducted is whatever regional government or provincial government who wants to conduct a kind of limitation on the activities of the people, they start communicating with the central government, and the central government will assess with the expert how the problem is, how severe is the problem. Why do they do that is because they don't want to cut all of the economic activities, but on the same time they want to mitigate the problem. The position of like a balancing between those two options make Indonesian government look like not sure and uncertain in dealing with the severity of issues, particularly in the area where the local government, local leaders, and local people are so critical. Jakarta, Papua, and many other parts of Indonesia asking a question about how far is this kind of uncertainty will be managed much more forcefully. So when you ask question whether Indonesia already conducting testing, contact tracing, and treatment, yes, they did it. They make sure that everybody has a face mask. And now in Bali, just starting from yesterday, if you don't put your mask, you will be charged $8 by the police. They will stop you and ask for the fine. Contact tracing and treatment are conducted by two different layers of authority in Indonesia. For testing and contact tracing is more a local level and a local institution kind of responsibility and authority. So financially also they are responsible. For after they knowing who got infected, they start provincial and national government will take over. So for the treatment, that kind of thing. The problem is that between contact tracing, testing, and treatment is this disjuncture, because many cases already identified but not pursued further, or maybe because the political calculation, the number is limited. So the data itself is sometimes become a question. So let me end it by saying that the balancing between letting the people to have their economic activities with the risk of infected are question now in Indonesia, because the number keep rising and the treatment is not totally fulfilled fully, and also the social security support from the government is also a big debate right now. So Indonesian government, Indonesian society, and the media are now in the middle of debating everything and also asking the clarity about the government policy. Let me stop there and then we continue.
Thank you, K2. It's interesting to see Indonesia because Indonesia is such a huge country with so many islands. So maybe that's why the local government is very important in this combat against pandemic. Okay, let's move it to South Korea, where the central government is taking a more visible leadership. So Professor Jong Kim, it's your turn.
Okay, so thank you very much. And at this time conference to prepare some performance of the democracies in Asia. So let me first give you the answer to achievement question here. So obviously there is some fundamental trade-off between the security and delivery in general, and the public health and the economy in particular in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic here. As far as in dealing with the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, South Korea has excelled on that point and as the top ranking nation among OECD countries. So it has kept the death rate below 5 per million, and the effective reduction rate between the average number of infections that an infectious individual transmits to susceptible individual far below 1. Actually, it's 0.76, and its economy has remained open during the entire pandemic, so mobility declined only to 10%. So all of those, the very difficult task to make us quite the balance between the public health and economy. South Korea seems to show very strong performance here. This is possible because South Korea can avoid some extreme measures such as the temporary lockdown strategy to reduce the mobility of people, or the herd immunity strategy to open the economy without any public health measure. Instead, South Korea has effectively combined personal hygiene and social distance and the public quarantine strategy to cut the ERR, or the effective reproduction rate. How this is possible is there are many the factors. I think one of the most important factors is its past experience suffering from the 2015 MERS outbreak. So due to that outbreak, the government response at the time was not just seen as slow, but the scarcity of test kits and the absence of the isolation wards and the inability to contact trace worsened the situation unnecessarily. That kind of lesson has been overcome in enacting 2015 Infectious Disease Control and Prevention Act, in which the government is required to disseminate all relevant information during a public health emergency on the virus spread, using a lot of the ICT technology here. So basically what the South Korean government can do effectively in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic has been prepared from the failure of the MERS outbreak in 2015. So other factors include some public health systems vigilance, which is the by February 4th, just 3 weeks after Chinese scientists had positive the genome of COVID-19, the company, the health company of South Korea have developed an effective diagnostic kits, and the other 5 companies followed soon after. So the diagnostic kits are well prepared in advance, and government can use the high quality ICT, as I said. So the develop distancing learning curricula and protocol and provide advice for companies in many other applications that were developed and deployed within weeks. So early response using the high quality ICT, the regime is also very important. And in doing so, the South Korean can make some public-private collaboration as a positive feedback between the information given by the government and corporation, followed by the citizens. So in a public health emergency, it is the government's responsibility to provide the best information possible as quickly as possible to the public through the smartphone apps, push notification and public service announcements. And society gains confidence and civic trust emerges in the information they are given. So it becomes the people's civic obligation to cooperate to reduce the spread of virus based on the information. So basically, thus far, South Korean, some exemplary case in which the citizens and the government make some positive feedback by providing necessary information transparently and the citizens taking this information effectively to produce some cooperative together behavior in order to collaborate in the public-private cooperation. So that's far key for the successful response of the South Korean government to the COVID-19 pandemic. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Jong Kim. I'd like to add that in South Korea, Center in charge of contagious disease control has gained so much public support. So recently, our government has announced they will make this center as an independent agency. All right, now let's move to the largest democracy in Asia, India. So Niranjan, it's your turn.
Thank you, and hello everyone. It's great to debate about this pandemic crisis. In India, particularly, is at a very, I would say, very, very critical juncture in terms of fighting the pandemic. Today, we are reporting largest number of new cases overtaking US, and our caseload have also crossed more than 3 million. So this was not the seen mid-March and April when the government imposed one of the strictest lockdown, where almost like everything was shut except for just emergency services. So mid-March when government, Modi government, especially the central government, because like most of the federal countries, especially contagious disease and management of the port and all border control, everything is with the federal government. So in a sense, federal government took the lead and imposed one of the strictest lockdown, taking cue from several other countries like Korea and others that it paid sort of dividend, including China also what it did Wuhan. So a lot of actually people in the New Delhi circle thought, especially the doctors, the medic who actually advised that this is the best way to do for a country of 1.3 billion population and one of the weakest public healthcare system. So and there was a lot of panic because simply India with such kind of density and such low level of public healthcare cannot afford a kind of infectious disease which can probably kill millions. So and some of the studies like John Hopkins and others predicted that by July India will have more than 250 million cases and probably 7 to 8 million deaths, and that created a kind of panic, and that led to lockdown, and that lockdown was enforced without even a warning, with just 4-hour notice, and which ultimately led to major crisis of migrant workers, because millions of migrant workers in different cities had no means even to put up and survive for several weeks, because this lockdown continued for several weeks. And many of you would have actually seen how thousands of migrants started walking to their native villages, when spending days, and hundreds of them died on the on the way, actually, because the central government and state government had banned any kind of public transportation system. So that led to a major humanitarian crisis. Having said this, I would actually go to the strategy, how country has been approaching this pandemic. One, in the beginning, it started with the lockdown and, putting all kind of social distancing norm and, in a phased manner, the government started also mobilizing resources in terms of expanding, healthcare system by opening, at every district, at least a kind of COVID hospital and producing also PP material, because India faced a lot of problem in the initial stage, especially importing this material from China, and China supply didn't actually come on time. So in a sense, India actually went for a mass production, and today one positive thing is that India is now exporting most of this material to almost 100 countries. So in a sense, this shows a great resilience to fighting a pandemic, and government, both state as well as federal government, have actually done well on that aspect. Second, with regard to how the both federal government as well as state governments manage this. See, in India, we are very competitive kind of federal system, in which the subnational governments have enormous power as far as healthcare, education is concerned. It is basically state subjects. So federal government doesn't have much power in that, because it only to one extent provides resources and technical support. But this pandemic, because it is a kind of health emergency, allowed the central government to take over many of the functions which in normal time the states should have actually handled, including issuing advisory, implementing, enforcing strict kind of social distancing norms, even using the sedition law, in emergency law, whatever at its disposal, to force many states actually to fall in line. So in a sense, this entire federal country has turned into a kind of unitary system, at least in the initial period. But once the case load started, becoming too much, so the central government had to concede the demands of the states more autonomy to handle, because they are the uh, local points, and they that is how they manage. Now, so in a sense, by virtue of necessity, that we are witnessing a kind of cooperative federalism, in which both center as well as states are actually put up a very good collaborative kind of joint efforts, and that is actually working well. If you look at a country of our size, there are at least a handful of states which have actually come out of this entire COVID, and brought almost 90% control. Like some of the southern states like Kerala, even large states like Maharashtra. You have cities like Mumbai, which is one of the most dense kind of city with so much of urban slums. And in fact, some of the urban slums like Dharavi, where you have seen that movie made that Slumdog Millionaires movie was made. And
I think I'm losing Niranjan, but I think he's almost talked many points. So it's very difficult to compare 5 Asian democracies. As we have heard, India has introduced very strong, harsh measures like a lockdown, emergencies. However, that kind of harsh measures could not stop India to be ranked number 3 in the world in terms of a number of people infected by COVID-19. And of course, we have to consider all this government capacity and the health system, insurance system, number of migrant workers, and how the country is vast or smaller with the population and so forth. But I noticed, especially among 3 Northeast Asian democracies, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, I think they put up many citizens' facial mask. That was very not comfortable for many, not only Westerners, and also many South Asians. I think it is because of these Northeast Asian countries had experienced SARS and MERS. All these contagious diseases make make citizens wearing masks as part of life, daily life. So it was much more easier for them. And also, there are many elements, common elements like government and the private partnerships and also the citizen trust in the health government and also very the well-designed the government programs, guidelines based on science, or many things. Okay. Now, I'd like to move to a second round of discussions. Here, I'd like to discuss, what is the impact of COVID-19 in democracy, in politics of each countries. Some countries, like in populist countries, the popular leaders weaponizing COVID-19 to consolidate their power. And if it's a polarized countries and the pandemic and become a tool for political divide, like we are seeing in the case of the United States, that is also one of the leading democracies in the world. So, and also there's an issue of minority groups, as a religious ethnic minority or other the minority groups with a different cultural background. So I'd like to ask the panelists to assess the impact of COVID-19 in their democracy right now, and also the future prospect, how this pandemic will affect in the long term your democracy. So again, let me invite Katie Chan first. Katie?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Lee. So let me talk briefly about democracy in Taiwan. Even though I would say that political parties, the two major political parties in Taiwan, they have very strong opinions. They often argue tremendously when it comes to different policies, economic policies, especially cross-strait policies, how to deal with China. But when it comes to dealing with COVID-19, even though the opposition is doing its best to, let's say, monitor the administration of how they combat the pandemic, when it comes to general policies, I would say all political parties are pretty synchronized. And even though the opposition now, after the local election in 2018, they capture about 14 cities, major cities in Taiwan. So the mayors, the local mayors also really adhere to the central government's instructions in enforcing wearing facial mask on public transportation, social distancing. So when it comes to political parties and political leaders, there's a slogan in Taiwan right now that says when it comes to combating the epidemic, all societal levels or government levels has to have one heart. So one focus on combating the pandemic instead of bickering politically. I would say that democracy and operations of democratic institutions in Taiwan has not been really affected by the pandemic. Taiwan has no lockdown, so people have been going to work since the beginning of this year. Children are going to school. I think they're about to start, or maybe they already started school for the fall semester. But the one thing that Taiwan's democracy that we are safeguarding and fighting for is the information warfare or disinformation campaign from our a big and authoritarian neighbor across the Taiwan Strait. So the attempt to distribute disinformation on how the Taiwanese administration is really not doing very well dealing with the pandemic. But at the same time, Taiwan has many NGOs and civil society members and also government institutions working together to put out clarification. Like, for example, in Taiwanese government, the executive yuan required that government institutions, when they receive one piece of disinformation, to dispute that within an hour or 2 hours time. So publicizing, make the public aware what's facts and what's disinformation has been something that civil societies and Taiwanese government has been working together on in order to safeguard the quality of democracies in Taiwan. Because what authoritarian regime wants for democracies is for citizens to not trust elected government officials, so that to not so they're not working very well together to combat pandemic and to allow the politicizing of such disease. One last point is that Taiwan has migrant workers. So what the government requires is that their employers has to be responsible of obtaining facial masks for them so they could protect themselves, and also when they go out in public as well. So and then the Taiwanese government also invoked stimulus voucher packages to trying to help people economically, and also help smaller and medium-sized businesses so that they're not so much negatively affected by the pandemic. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. It's very amazing. And because the pandemic doesn't create negative impact domestically because of very strong bipartisan support and giving the government the power to manage this virus. However, you have disinformation from China. It's more from external actor. So that's very notable thing we have to observe. Okay, and then let's move to then Japan. So Michael, tell us about how Japanese government and civil society, are checking the democratic principles.
Yes, thank you. Well, in Japan, I would say basically there's a continuation of the existing state of democracy. This is probably due to the already long history of democracy in Japan, and so democratic values has been embedded into the politicians' mindset and people's mindset. And so when it comes to COVID-19 policies, rule of law has been well maintained. As I said, even with the emergency declaration, there was no lockdown, everything. And also freedom of the press and freedom of speech, access to information have been also well maintained without the government, for example, thinking about implementing fake news law kind of things. And so well, it's going as usual. And freedom of assembly and behavior has been also maintained basically. And so people can have gatherings as far as they keep some social distance and wear masks. And there's a well-paid care to privacy protection as well. And so the government has not been used does not use IT-based tracking, which violates personal, which is attack to personal information. And instead, the government started using what they call COCOA, which uses Bluetooth in June, although that's not downloaded so much yet. And so those continuation of the democracy in Japan, I think, is a positive side. But there are, I would say, three issues with Japanese democracy. Well, one is the lack of weakness of the information transparency. As I said, well, expert meeting was established, but well, the meeting records of the expert meeting was not released. Actually, even was not created in the beginning. And also, although that began being created, but the amount of information disclosed is still limited. And also, meetings amongst the cabinet members is also not disclosed so much, other than summaries. And thus, it makes difficult for us to check the appropriateness of policies. And secondly, there has been some discriminatory policies toward vulnerables and minorities, especially when it comes to emergency support packages for students or medium and small businesses. Those people, such as school children of Korean schools that are related to North Korea, and international students and sex workers are having some either they are excluded from the target, or there are some extra conditionality for them to receive those support. Finally, this is not about the government policies, but the society started checking with each other as to whether they are restraining their behavior. So, like each people, when they find people walking around, for example, they report to the police saying like, oh, well, there are two guys dating with each other. Well, are you okay? Well, are you sure that you are not going to arrest them? And so this became like a police state or fascist state culture or state of democracy in Japan. And so this is pretty much an issue with the civil society, not the government, but what we have to tackle in the future. As for the future, because during the COVID-19, democracy has been basically continued, and all those issues that I talked about are what we have seen in the past as well. And so probably there will be a continuation of that kind of state of democracy. That's how I say.
Thank you, Michael. It's very interesting to hear that there is a lack of information transparency at the part of public authority and government decisions. That's something, very, drawing my attention. And now let's move it to Indonesia. And Ketu, tell us your story.
Yes. When you ask a question about what kind of cooperation politically, formal politics happened in Indonesia to respond to the COVID-19, I kind of laugh in the beginning because you asked a question about bipartisan, because there is no opposition anymore in Indonesia since 2019. The major leaders of opposition now become our Ministry of Defense. General Prabowo will become a Ministry of Defense in Jokowi cabinet, and then also several actors at the opposition parties now become a government. So we have only the ruling elites, ruling government now. So of course it become one policy dealing with that. However, there is a resistance among civil society actors and also religious leader in terms of two issues. One is that when the government tried to impose social emergency, many civil society organizations said that no, this is too much. It become a pretext to enforce a law which is allowing the government to jeopardize the human rights issues. Second issue is about, as I mentioned before, the decree from the president, a presidential decree on supporting financial facilities for who affected by the law. There is a certain element there which is kind of protecting the central government from any scrutiny, any accountability question, particularly when you cannot bring them to the court of law. In the end, that become a problem. So the second issue is about what about the impact toward minority? There is a big problem because in the beginning, when the central government try to respond, it is uncertain. They take like very light on the issues of COVID until there are several casualties, people dying and problem. And then during that time, the central government allowing the airplane still traveling from one area to area, particularly from the epicenter, Jakarta. A minority, particularly people from Papua, thought that this one it will be affecting their ethnic sustainability, because when people from Jakarta bring disease, virus, and problems, so the leader from Sorong area take his own power by closing the airport. That's a response of minority. Some area also try to respond it, thinking about what is the impact of this COVID to the sustainability of each ethnic groups or religion groups. And if you are asking question about CSO and media, this is the really tough time for Indonesia, because civil society and media try to make sure whatever the government do, they will not do harm to our society. So human rights coalition group are so active to defending the people's right, and also there are legal aid institute. There are also Indonesian Corruption Watch. We are so active to make sure that all of the government policy will not be corrupted or like that. And the media right now is much more problematic, because some media in Indonesia owned by political leaders, and then the bias toward their political party are so strong. But there is alternative, like in social media, blogs, critical voices, and some also new international brands media like CNN Indonesia. We have Reuters Indonesia. They are bringing the data and also alternative voices to the debate. The last point I want to make is that the impact toward of the government policies responding to the COVID, there is a bias of class, because when the government say that to prevent the COVID, you need to stay at home, work from home, and there is a video about middle class using what we are doing like now, Cisco WebEx, communicating to each other. Yeah, and then people are so criticizing them. They're so fierce, because 90% of Indonesians are working as an informal sector. What we are doing right now using technology is so alien for them. So saying that the bias of upper class is one of the major things the government try to respond, and that is from my overview the story of Indonesia. It's a story of full of contradiction and struggles.
소리가 안 들려요? Okay. All right. So if I sum up the Indonesian case, it sounds like the role of opposition party was already very weak before the coming of the pandemic. One thing I have noticed is that the fighting against the pandemic is usually create kind of a rallying effect, trying to support the government. I think it happens usually during the crisis time. During the crisis, people tend to give power to the ruling party and the government. So it's very important to see this effect. And in Indonesian case, K2 is reporting media is not doing kind of balancing work, because most medias are owned and controlled by political leaders. But that's very different from a South Korean case, because media in South Korea is one of the sources in checking and criticizing government policies. So it's a very good time to move to South Korean case. So let's invite Professor Jong Kim again.
Okay, thank you. So, in regard for the democracy questions, so first thing I have to mention is that the most of case, the South Korea shows the successfully addressing the pandemic is possible without violating democratic principles, processes, or procedures. So, according to Varieties of Democracies Pandemic Democratic Violation Index, the South Korea is among the 24 countries that show no big violations in terms of first, say, no time limit on emergency measures or discriminatory measures or de jure violation of non-deliverable rights from the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or restrictions on media freedom, or disproportionate limitation on the role of legislature, or abusive enforcement. All of those criteria, South Korea does not have not shown any huge violation in terms of rule of law. So, at least with regard to the how to deal with the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, South Korea also shows some exemplary case among even the democracies here. So how is it possible? It's my second question is basically it is possible because there emerged a bipartisan consensus between the government and opposition in dealing with the first wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the issue of how government deal with the COVID-19 pandemic has made a national salience that overshadows all other local concerns in the April legislative elections. So the effectiveness of the government response to COVID-19 crisis is apparently tinged more with colors of so-called valence issue or the performance issue rather than the positional or partisan issue. So this is the one of the most important factor that can explain why we can have the bipartisan consensus at least in dealing with the COVID-19 crisis. But this the popular verdict of the general election in April is conditional on this in the sense that the government has the mandate to deal with exclusively for the COVID-19 public health issue as well as its consequence in terms of the economy. So if the government and the President Moon try to seek their the legislative power to seek their partisan issues such as the real estate policy or prospective office reform, then possibly that kind of the bipartisan consensus will disappear, and it is the real situation of the South Korea because the President Moon's job approval ratings have been fluctuated from 42% in the last week of February to 71%. It's the highest in the first week of May. That's the major cause for the landslide victory for the governing party. But in the second week of August, the job approval rating falls to the 39%. So the South Korean people has some conditional mandate on the Moon Jae-in government in dealing with COVID-19 pandemic as well as the economic recovery. Other than that, they can withdraw their support for the government, then possibly bipartisan consensus will collapse. Some other issues I have to mention is that religious minorities basically suffer from social stigmatization. So so-called Sungkyunkwan, or more recently, Sungkyunkwan Church. They are some the super spreader in the South Korean society, becoming famous as the Christian cult supposedly responsible for the country's outbreak. So, as the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom indicated, South Korea might provide a vivid example of how public health emergency can increase the risk to marginalized religious groups. The way the group have been treated bring a tough question of religious freedom, pandemic responsibility, and media scapegoating. So possibly on the middle of the second wave of South Korea, one of the most important issues, in my opinion, is how to deal with this religious minority. And possibly the size of the minority could increase because now the President Moon tried to have some confrontation attitude toward especially the Protestant church. And so thus far, anyway, South Korea has been successful in striking some balance between democratic principle as well and the public health, the prevention of the pandemic. So thus far, it's okay. But now we are in the real test. How to deal with the second wave of pandemic is much more difficult for the government, and depending on the performance of government, possibly the cooperation from this citizen, some possibly intensify and they maximize. But if the government failed to fulfill its own task, then possibly bipartisan consensus would disappear. So that's how those companies.
Thank you, Professor Jong Kim. During this COVID-19 period, many countries had the elections. Some countries postponed because of virus their elections. In the case of South Korea, because Korean government performed pretty well and was praised by international media, that was a very critical point for the ruling party to seek the majority of our national parliament in April 15th elections. Now, I'm very wondering, because of a relative failure in the case of Modi government in India, but still President Modi is very popular in India. So I'd like to invite Niranjan to talk about how the COVID-19 is affecting your democracy, especially your president's popularity.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Prime Minister Modi's popularity has gone up to all-time high while handling the pandemic, and incidentally, we are ranked third, and we are producing maximum number of new cases every day. So that's an irony, and that shows also populism. Populism and sort of messianic kind of figure Mr. Modi is, and in many way, I would say that while pandemic may be very, very severe for and almost it has impacted every institution, but there are politicians, there are institutions which are also profiting from this emergency. So that popularity rate is a kind of evidence of that. So crisis makes also some people to manage and create a perception that they are doing everything right, and people just go by that. Coming down to India's case, about 4 or 5 things I actually shared in my paper earlier. One, I would say my assessment is that this pandemic has exposed India's democracy to the maximum extent. It's especially the weak points and the vulnerability, because earlier we used to make so much of claim that we are quite a free society, media is free, opposition can put the government in check, and judiciary is very active. But a lot of these things have been actually proved wrong in this pandemic. First, I would give a sort of assessment about the executive branch, because that's the first point of kind of contact with the common people on this pandemic, and it is the fast mover. So executive branch, both federal government as well as the national sub-national governments, they moved very swiftly, as I said earlier, and put the lockdown, started taking sort of social distancing measure, and issued a lot of guidelines for the people to follow. And then also they took a lot of emergency measures in terms of, those who are violating, they can be penalized and punished, other things. But what has happened in this pandemic, that executive authorities, both the federal government as well as the state governments, have actually misused to a great extent. In fact, there is widespread excess of executive powers. Police have been arresting people who just raise inconvenient questions. Media has been silenced in many ways, and there have been all kind of restrictions put against opposition leader and civil society. So, in a sense, what we are witnessing is that emergency powers used by the governments is actually becoming, sort of easy excuse during this pandemic, and governments at all levels are, just doing whatever they can do, and there is no accountability. The second thing is about legislative. Legislative business is completely paralyzed because parliament and state assemblies are actually shut. They cannot open because of the infection, and what is happening is that lot of appointments and lot of decisions, lot of important bills are all pending. But what is actually this pandemic has helped is that the executive has taken this as to its advantage, and issues taken the route of ordinances. So a lot of ordinances have been passed by the executive because legislative cannot be in session. So and some of them are very draconian, like surveillance and imposing a lot of restriction on people. So in a sense, this has actually provided executive to take away a lot of legislative powers, using this pandemic as a sort of excuse. And the third, I think, most noticeable thing, which is a kind of erosion in our democratic system, is the weakening of the judiciary. The judiciary hasn't actually lived up to the expectation, because India has one of the very, very active and independent judiciary in the world, and it used to take a lot of decisions suo motu to protect civil liberties, and check the executive. But in the pandemic, what has happened, especially the Supreme Court, the highest court, has actually been very inconsistent, and in many ways taken actually just gone by whatever the government actually says, including like migrant workers issue, which millions of them suffered, and there were a lot of petitions, and the Supreme Court for a month almost said that there is no problem. But when there was a lot of outcry, and a lot of ex-judges started writing, the court had to intervene. But one good thing about judiciary is that lower courts and the high courts, especially at the state levels, have done very well, and they have taken on executive on many things, especially on arrest and illegal detention. So while the federal government, especially the highest court, has not lived up to expectation, lower courts have actually taken off very well. And the fourth thing is about the press freedom. Media has actually suffered, especially those media which are independent and relatively, standing up to the executive and raising inconvenient questions, have faced a lot of backlashes, and there have been hundreds of I would say detention and arrest in several states, and some of them have been put in jail without kind of getting bail. So in a sense, actually, that's a major sort of I would say negative aspects of this pandemic. And then second thing about opposition. Opposition also, initial stage like Korea and many other countries tried to take a bipartisan line and support the government, because this is a pandemic and health emergency. It cannot actually be seen opposing government on any move. So initial couple of months, opposition was trying to do its best to support the government. But when the government actually started misusing many of the powers and started failing on many parameters, so opposition started raising many inconvenient questions. But what has happened is that there have been so much of threats, and opposition has been in many ways put by the ruling party as a villain, and some kind of they have created a kind of victimhood that they are not getting any support, and opposition is raising question at a time of health emergency in which everyone is trying to fight and survive. So it's a kind of populism, and in many way typical the populist leader do. So create a kind of enemy. One of the worst thing that has happened in this pandemic is the polarization. Given this country had witnessed actually sharp polarization in the last couple of months, especially when India witnessed last year kind of mushrooming protest on citizenship bill, which targeted certain minority group, and then we have followed by riots in Delhi. So this actually pandemic suddenly opened the kind of this polarization when few thousands, especially the Tabligh Jamaat, a conservative Muslim faith, which had actually assembled in Delhi, and many of them are found actually have been infected. So that actually provided a kind of handle for the right-wing leaders to create Islamophobia and generalize the entire Muslim community as a kind of the spreader of the infection, and that led to a lot of problem in the initial stage, because a lot of people, especially from those communities, started hiding, and they didn't report the infection, and it ultimately led to very sort of mishandling of the pandemic in the initial stage. So to just sum up, saying that India has actually India's democratic institutions have not actually live up to the expectations, especially the judiciary and executive has actually misused many of the powers. Despite doing many good things, it has also misused. Police also has violated. They try to muzzle the dissent, and they try to corner the press, arrest a lot of journalists who raise inconvenient questions. In fact, they put a ban on several websites which were reporting many of the pandemic crisis. So overall, if you look at India's democratic institutions haven't actually done well, considering we are quite a resilient and very strong democracy.
And for reporting the problems that India is facing right now. I guess from our 5 panelists reporting about their country cases, we can see there are quite relatively strong bipartisan cooperations in Taiwan and Korea and also Japan, while the opposition parties and opposition forces are put into more defensive, more isolated position in case of Indonesia and India. It's very interesting to see the common element that in this checks and balance of democracy, this COVID-19 is strengthening the power of executive administrations. As Niranjan has pointed out, the Congress power or the judiciary decisions are all kind of tied up to this importance of quarantines and in the administrative guidelines. So this is a kind of problem in a sense, especially for me. I'd like to address to all panels, what about this accumulated data about the people's health and their consumption behavior, and those very sensitive data are all in the hands of public authority. Is there any check or law, that the government would erase all this personal data? So I'm curious about that. And that is related to our Q&A questions. First question, and some people, I don't know his or her name, it is asking because the success elements, if he can identify the most important two, is government capacity of especially Northeast Asian countries and citizen trust. They seem to be very important in flattening the COVID-19. However, this person is worrying about lack of discussion from individual citizens about the government public decision-making process. So let's say during this health crisis, typically there is a more top-down decision with so much power from the government, but he's concerning about the due procedure of democracy, emphasizing and valuing the different opinions, and also more plural the actors who can raise their voices. So he's asking basically the democratic procedural point to this our fight against the pandemic. Okay, anyone who likes to address to these questions? Niranjan, go ahead.
Yeah, I can speak something about the data things and surveillance. This actually has been a major issue in India since last 4 months. When we began the sort of lockdown in March, one of the first thing the government did is to set up a kind of app. It is called Arogya Setu, which is a kind of app that monitors your movement and whether you have sort of it's a basically self-reporting kind of app. You have to report that you have to share most of your information, including health information, and then whether you have the temperature, whether you have any people around your location being infected with this virus. So in a sense, that was seen as so that government agency can track and then quarantine and do the testing and other things. So it was seen as something that can stop or prevent the spread of the infection, and especially they can define the red zones. Initially, it was thought that it will actually help, but what happened that a lot of time actually whatever data people started self-reporting, and many cases those data started getting leaked to the public, and that created a lot of public outcry, and in fact this issue was actually taken to the Supreme Court, and unfortunately the Supreme Court actually didn't support the public outcry, and it supported the government, saying that it's a public health emergency, and each one of us have to actually cooperate with the government. And of course government clarified later on a lot of, because of public pressure, that it is not using or trying to harvest those data for any other purpose, and there will be data protection, privacy will be kept in mind. But given in the past, in which we have a lot of controversy, in which many of the data being leaked, and so people, a lot of people have concern about this.
Okay, other panelists have a answer to my questions about this information, how we no
Yes.
opinion?
Can I respond?
Yeah, about this, the procedural aspect, especially how we checking the government with too much information about people.
Yes. Indonesia already prepare about the procedural aspect so vividly. That's one of the main strength of Indonesian democracy. Despite a lot of weakness, which is procedural element. So the data about the number of people who got infected is renewed every day, and there are a level local task force. Central government created the central government task force, provincial element task force, and also local level, and people can access it easily. Now the question is whether the number put there is politically motivated. That's the question, because sometimes we check several death victims infected by COVID, but the number of the death in the local task force is not moving. So we are questioning how far it goes. In terms of whether the people can review legally about what the data or the government policy, we have a judicial review mechanism. The people can review it through the constitutionality of the regulation and the data through constitutional court, but also they can review the government decision through the Supreme Court. At least one or two cases, local, the people win when they challenge the government. So when we ask question whether the data is accurate, that is the debate we have now in Indonesia, and whether the people engage and impact. From my perspective, when we discuss about democracy, in Indonesia case, we should see it not procedural formal way, because when we see, we miss the point when we only focus on the government, legislative, in the community, village people, they engage to make sure how the COVID can be manifested, can be responded economically and also politically. So Indonesian democracy in the lowest level, at the grassroots level, it's kind of vibrant and bring a question further about what is the government and the state do when the people are so engaged in the process of Indonesian process.
Thank you, Ketu. Now I will move to the next questions. It's about South Korea, so I will ask Professor Jong Kim to answer this question. Maybe it's not easy because it requires more professional knowledge about the health and medical things. And the question is, how the Korean government is ready for the second wave of COVID-19 that is rising with 400 and 300 new cases of infected people. Do you have any answer?
Okay, so basically, some say public health infrastructure, as well as I said, the ICT infrastructure and the democratic capacity of South Korea is ready for, say, dealing with the second wave of the COVID-19. That's the basic facts. But here's some difficult issue for the South Korean government to something like this. So when we delve into the data in 1918 and 1919, so-called the Spanish flu, there were actually 3 different waves, and the second wave is the highest one, and this is the most, say, the critical phase of the pandemic there. And many of the medical as well as public health experts predict that if the South Korean government cannot deal with the second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic in an effective way, then possibly the situation is getting more serious. Many kind of the public health administration could not be sufficient to deal with the increasing number of the confirmed cases, and then this could produce some pressure on, say, the hospitalization and the other the infrastructure. Then, in the first wave, we have from the public health the bureaucrats to the civil cooperation and the information provided by the government. So this is a very good sign of the positive feedback. But the second wave, if South Korean government could not be well prepared or to make some policy failure or try to enforce some measure, not in the initial stage, but too late, then possibly there emerges some negative feedback from the public health sector and the other medical and hospitalization infrastructure is the over-pressured, and then civic cooperation and trust will decline. Then government cannot deal with the issue in a bipartisan way. So this is some kind of critical moment for the South Korean government as well as South Korean citizens, how to deal with the second wave of the COVID-19. Thus far, we have confirmed 300 to 400 levels of the confirmed case, and many medical experts recommend that we need to make a transition to so-called the temporary lockdown style measure, but the government has to think and consider about the consequence, its negative consequence on the economy, which possibly that's why the South Korean government now have to think about the trade-off between new measure of the government transfer, income transfer versus the fiscal discipline. So I don't know which one is the more critical and which one is more, say, emergent. But anyway, thus far, one of the big secrets for the South Korean government successful dealing with the COVID-19 is that once they make the policy decision, then they show thus far seen inconsistency in implementing their policies. So for the second wave, I would say that if the government try to take the voice from the medical and public health experts about the earlier implementation of the temporary lockdown measure, then I think it's better to have that measure as early as possible. So that just reduce the cost in a minimal way, say for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and then try to focus on the economic recovery issue. So this is certainly a trade-off between public health and the economy and liberty, but we have to make, if we have to make some decision right now, then we have to, in my opinion, put the emphasis on public health aspects rather than the economic recovery aspects.
Thank you, Professor Kim. Now, from the audience, there is a question to Niranjan about Indian case. You already talked about the lockdown effects upon migrant workers. And our participant is asking, how about the paying rents? And because rent paying is so difficult for the immigrant workers, and also they don't have a good social security, and they are forced to going back to villages. So what would be your opinion, how the Indian government should help this huge number of migrant workers in your country?
That's a very good question. In fact, when we faced the lockdown in the very initial weeks in the March, this was actually one of the most kind of toughest kind of question which was raised by a lot of analysts that millions of migrants and a lot of people working in the low kind of paying jobs. Once the lockdown is imposed and the work is paralyzed, do not have the means to pay their rents, monthly rents, and also provide kind of basic this thing support to their families and their families also who live in villages. So this and this question was very critical because we have a very poor kind of social protection system in which we have almost like 90% of our labor are actually in the informal sector, and informal sector almost like 70% out of them do not have the kind of regular kind of social protection, pension or any kind of even healthcare facilities or insurance for them is very, very negligible. So given that this question bothered everyone, and I think there are a couple of steps which the government has actually done well to address this issue. One, the central government and state government, they issued kind of advisory to almost all the owners of this different societies and different apartments that postpone their rents actually for next few months. And this actually has gone very well, especially because this was seen as a kind of crisis that on which nobody has control, and poor workers will be finished actually. So a lot of actually factory owners, a lot of entrepreneurs and other things who engage these workers and provide them, accommodation. In any case, they waive those things because they paid nominally. But a lot of private apartment other thing, they postponed this. But then we also got reports and media coverage of a lot of them had to leave their sort of houses and go for their own villages because some of them started asking for them the rents other thing. And in fact that actually led to the crisis, especially past couple of months it was okay because people thought this pandemic might probably reduce and things will be normal in a couple of months. But when by May things didn't improve and the infection started spreading more, and so so a lot of private people also have pressure to collect rents because even for them many of them have their bank loans and other obligations. So this actually was a catch-22 situation. So while a lot of people wanted to wait, but then they have other obligations. So we had a migrant crisis. Millions of migrants, in fact, started working on the road is largely because they can't afford to pay the rents because rents are generally very high in many cities. And then the second thing, whatever support government provided in terms of social protection, that came like few thousand rupees to their accounts were transferred, and then they were provided with some food kind of packets every month. But that is not good enough to live with. So this crisis is still on. And but what happened in last couple of months is that most of the migrants have actually left to their villages. So in a sense, because they wanted to escape this rent burden. So partially at least that problem is solved because they have gone to their villages.
Thank you, Niranjan. It's already past 2 p.m. However, there are two more questions, so let me invite Michael to these questions. You already talked about lack of transparency in your government decision process. And one of our audience is pointing out it's not just the government trying to steal anything, it's a lack of digital transformation of Japanese public sector because many Japanese government still use paper documents rather than the digital way of collecting data and sharing information. So do you think this time will speed up kind of digitalization of your government public service? And what's your opinion about this?
Thank you. Well, that's a very important question. Well, I'm actually pessimistic about the possibility that digitalization can be progressed through this COVID experience. For example, well, I talked about the central roles of the public health centers in deciding the testing, deciding the permission for PCR testing. And well, they use faxes, not emails or other kinds of digital information sharing methods to share information about infections. And so there has been reports that fax papers are accumulated in those health centers, and which makes it difficult for those center staff members to actually see the numbers of cases and so forth. And also the national diet has not been implementing digital voting either, and so and yet well, the transparency of information is not necessarily only about digitalization. There has been this issue that the governmental officials do not make records of those meetings, the content of those meetings, and that, well, there were already big issues like school building in Osaka and in Okayama, which had no record of prime ministers negotiation with other governmental members, trying to allocate some, trying to give favorable conditions for schools. And so this kind of lack of transparency issue has been continuing, and it's likely to continue even if the digitalization can be progressed.
Thank you, Michael. Our last question is to Katie. In South Korea, the successful quarantine measures was praised internationally, and our foreign ministry is trying to use this case, let's say successful health governance, as a content of public diplomacy. And our foreign minister is taking leadership in convening this health roundtable among diplomats and so forth. And Taiwan is doing fantastically in the fights against COVID-19. Is your government using your successful measure as a new content of public diplomacy?
Thank you very much for the questions. Actually, Taiwan's administration has implemented policies and also a slogan. Our President Tsai has said it several times in her public statement that the statement is Taiwan can help and Taiwan is helping. So everything it can to assist countries in the region, our allies, and around the world on combating the pandemic, and also demonstrating that including Taiwan on the international platform or international organization is ultimately helpful for everyone involved. So I think right now Taiwan has donated about 51 million facial masks to about 80 countries around the world. And also there's exchanges of information when it comes to developing vaccines, exchanging medical supplies and materials between Taiwan and other countries in order to combat this pretty horrible and disease. And I think that the Taiwanese government has been really utilizing Taiwan's ability to assist countries around the world to combat the pandemic in order to, I would say, make awareness for the positive role that Taiwan could play, not only in the region, but also around the world. From the beginning of the outbreak, international media also was discussing and recognizing Taiwan's ability to combat the pandemic. It's fortunate, but also very unfortunate. Taiwan has suffered under the outbreak of SARS 17 years ago. So within the 17 years, Taiwanese are really well aware the atrocities that might cause by an outbreak. So this time around, when COVID-19 breaks, Taiwanese from civil societies to government to political parties all came together to trying to not only help ourselves, but also trying to contribute in helping other countries around the world. And I think to very positive results for Taiwan.
Thank you very much, Katie. Now it's time to wrap up our discussions. We talked a lot about 5 cases of Asian democracies. Of course, there are, some countries did better and some countries did relatively poorly. But our point is, what kind of democratic principles we have to pay attention in this fight against COVID-19. And we all recognize the importance of state capacity to collect data and to coordinate with the private sector and also with the local government. And at the same time, we see very important citizen trust to comply to government guidelines. But at the same time, we have seen some minority groups and then immigrant workers are isolated. And also there are problems of some disinformation cases. And mostly we concerned about too much power to administration. and also the increasing capacity, surveillance capacity of the government. So I guess civil society and democracy activists have to watch how, how the state is controlling this huge accumulation of data of individual citizens. Okay, so it was very interesting and exciting to listen to the discussion from 5 panelists, and I'd like to thank them all, and also I'd like to thank excellent questions from the floor, and I'd like to ask audience to fill up satisfaction survey using QR code. Thank you so much, and we'd like to continue this kind of conversation in next webinar. That's our purpose of ADRN, to create this kind of platform to exchange our views and our concerns and our opinions about the democracy of Asia's future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Lee.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. It was very.
Next time.
Yeah. Bye.